Story 1: The Eyes in the Trees. Last summer, my cousin and I decided to camp in a remote forest neither of us had ever visited. The place was dense and isolated, which was exactly what we wanted. The first day was uneventful, just setting up camp and exploring the area. But that night, things took a turn. As we sat by the fire, I felt like we were being watched. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia, but then I noticed my cousin glancing nervously into the trees. We both heard it at the same time, a rustling in the leaves, but there was no wind. Then I saw them, two glowing eyes peering at us from the darkness. They were high up, like whatever it was, stood taller than a person. My cousin whispered, "Do you see that?" I nodded, too scared to speak. We decided to quietly retreat to the tent, but the eyes followed us, staying just out of the light. We didn't sleep that night, and when morning came, there was nothing to be found. But I swear, those eyes watched us the entire night. Story 2: The Footprints. A few years ago, I went on a solo camping trip to clear my head. The forest was beautiful, and I found a perfect spot near a small stream. I spent the day hiking and returned to my camp just before dusk. That night, I was awakened by a noise outside my tent. I held my breath, listening. The sound was soft, like footsteps, but it wasn't consistent, more like something was pacing back and forth. I finally gathered the courage to look outside, but there was nothing there. The next morning, I found something that chilled me to the bone. All around my tent were footprints, not animal tracks, but human. They were barefoot, and judging by the depth of the prints, whoever made them was heavy. The footprints circled my tent over and over, and then led off into the woods. I packed up and left as fast as I could. I still can't explain who or what it was, but I know I was not alone that night. Story 3: The Old Man's Warning. My friends and I were on a weekend camping trip in a forest that was said to be haunted. We didn't believe in that stuff, so we were excited to prove the rumors wrong. On our first night, as we were setting up camp, an old man approached us out of nowhere. He looked rough, like he'd been living in the woods for a while. He warned us to leave, saying the forest wasn't safe after dark. We laughed it off, thinking he was just a crazy hermit. He shook his head and walked away, disappearing into the trees. That night, strange things started happening. We heard whispers in the wind, saw shadows moving in the corner of our eyes, and our fire wouldn't stay lit. By the middle of the night, we were so freaked out that we packed up and left. As we were driving away, I looked back and saw the old man standing at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. I don't know what was in that forest, but I'm glad we listened to him. Story 4: The Silent Forest. A group of us decided to camp in a forest known for its wildlife. We were excited to see deer, maybe even a bear. But from the moment we set up camp, something felt off. The forest was too quiet, no birds, no insects, nothing. That night, we all woke up at the same time, around 3 a.m. The silence was overwhelming, almost suffocating. Then we heard it, a single, loud knock on a tree, like someone had struck it with a bat. It was followed by more knocks, echoing through the forest, getting closer. We stayed in our tents, too scared to investigate. The knocking continued for what felt like hours, until it suddenly stopped, and the forest fell silent again. The next morning, we packed up and left. As we were leaving, we noticed something strange. The trees around our campsite had deep, fresh gouges in them, like something had been striking them with incredible force. We never figured out what made those sounds, and none of us have returned to that forest since. Story 5: The Abandoned Campsite. While hiking deep into a national forest, my boyfriend and I stumbled upon an old, abandoned campsite. The tent was still there, collapsed and covered in leaves, and there were remnants of a campfire that hadn't been used in a long time. Curious, we decided to set up our camp nearby. As night fell, we started hearing noises coming from the direction of the abandoned site. It sounded like someone was walking around, crunching leaves underfoot. My boyfriend went to check it out, but found nothing. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of something dragging across the ground. I looked out of the tent and saw a shadowy figure near the old campsite, slowly moving in our direction. We didn't stick around to see what it was. We grabbed our stuff and ran. To this day, I wonder what happened to the person who left that campsite behind. Story 6: The Haunted Path. Last year, I went camping with some friends in a forest that had a reputation for being haunted. We didn't believe the stories, but we were excited to see if anything spooky would happen. On the second night, we decided to take a walk down a narrow path that led deeper into the woods. As we walked, we started hearing footsteps behind us, but every time we turned around, there was no one there. The further we walked, the louder the footsteps became until it sounded like someone was running towards us. We panicked and sprinted back to our campsite, but the footsteps followed us the whole way. When we finally got back to the campfire, the footsteps stopped. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to sleep. In the morning, we found fresh footprints on the path we had taken, but they weren't ours. They were larger, and there were more of them than there should have been. We packed up and left, and none of us have talked about that night since. Story 7: The Shadow in the Tent. I was camping with a few friends in a remote forest that was known for being a bit eerie. On our last night, we were sitting around the campfire when one of my friends mentioned feeling like we were being watched. We all laughed it off, but that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was outside our tent. Around midnight, I saw a shadow moving on the tent wall, like someone was walking around outside. I whispered to my friend, but he was fast asleep. The shadow circled the tent, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps. I was too scared to move. Eventually, the shadow stopped, and I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. In the morning, I found strange, smudged footprints all around our tent. They didn't look human, and they didn't lead anywhere. They just started and stopped around the tent. We left immediately, and I've never camped in that forest again. Story 8: The Lost Hiker. A few years ago, my girlfriend and I went camping in a forest known for its hiking trails. We were planning to spend a few days exploring the area, but on our first night, something strange happened. We were sitting by the fire when we heard someone calling for help in the distance. It sounded like a man, and he was yelling that he was lost. We grabbed our flashlights and followed the voice into the woods, but no matter how far we walked, we couldn't find him. The voice kept getting fainter, and eventually, it just stopped. We turned back, but by then, we were completely lost. It took us hours to find our way back to the campsite, and when we finally did, we were exhausted. The next morning, we asked a park ranger if anyone had reported a lost hiker, but he said no one had. We never figured out who or what was calling for help that night, but we packed up and left right after. Story 9: The Forgotten Campsite. A couple of years ago, I went camping with my brother in a forest we'd never been to before. We found a nice, secluded spot and set up camp. The first night was peaceful, but the second night, something felt off. As we sat around the fire, we noticed an old, overgrown trail leading deeper into the woods. Curious, we decided to follow it. About half a mile in, we found an old, abandoned campsite. The tents were still there, moldy and collapsed, and there was a rusted-out car half buried in the dirt. Suddenly, we heard a noise coming from the direction of our camp, like something was rummaging through our stuff. We ran back, but when we got there, everything was untouched. That night, I woke up to the sound of whispering outside the tent. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a conversation. My brother heard it too, and we both lay there, terrified, until it stopped. In the morning, we found our campsite trashed, like something had torn through it in a frenzy. We packed up and left, and I still wonder. Here are the remaining 2 stories to complete your request. Story 10, The Phantom Campfire. My buddies and I were on a weekend camping trip in a forest known for its legends of strange occurrences. We found a great spot and set up camp. Everything was going well until the second night when we noticed something odd. Around midnight, we saw a faint glow through the trees, like another campfire. But we knew there were no other campers nearby. Curious, we decided to check it out. As we got closer, we could see a fire burning with nobody around it. The strange thing was, the fire didn't seem to be consuming the wood, no smoke, no crackling. Suddenly, the fire flickered out, leaving us in complete darkness. We stood there, frozen, until one of us broke the silence, and we hightailed it back to our campsite. We didn't sleep at all that night, and at first light, we packed up and left. I still can't explain what we saw, but I know I never want to see it again. Story 11, The Watcher in the Woods. A couple of years ago, I went camping with my girlfriend in a dense forest. We found a perfect spot next to a small creek and set up our tent. Everything was perfect until we went to bed that night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping outside the tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I noticed a shadow standing just outside, barely visible through the tent fabric. It was tall and still, just watching us. I shook my girlfriend awake, and we both stared at the shadow, too scared to move. After what felt like hours, the shadow finally turned and walked away. We didn't hear any more noises that night, but neither of us slept. The next morning, we found large footprints around our tent, leading off into the forest. We packed up and left immediately, and I haven't been back to that forest since.